For as long as I can remember, I have been a historian. I would read my history textbooks in my math and English classes instead of the assigned materials in school. History reads like superhero comic books. Stuff in between the covers. The brave African-American men I would read about were superheroes to me. Reading stories of the Buffalo Soldiers, the Tuskegee Airmen, and the 365 Infantry Regiment were my Falcon and Black Panther. However, they were never queer like me. I was told that to be queer, black, and male was to violate all the values that they fought for. Not just for our community, but for the potential on what African-American men can be. Comic books have always been a platform for the possibility for the outcasts in society in envisioning the ideas, versions of themselves. But these versions of themselves for most of the comic book industry history have been limited to straight representation that's barely ever queer. Part of the reason was the Comic Code Authority, an organization which censored comic books in America for nearly 50 years. This episode of The Shady Historian, I will be focusing on the Comic Code Authority, as well as the history of queer representation in American comics. In the 1950s, comic books were seen as a dangerous influence on youth culture. In 1954, Dr. Wertham published his infamous book, Seduction to the Innocent, wherein he compared the comic book industry of the 1950s to the fascist leader, Hitler. Isn't that shit crazy? Fuckery. The book led to numerous congressional hearings because, you know, the American taxpayer in the 1950s had nothing else better to do. And this led to the near almost shutting down of the entire comic book industry itself. What this led to was a call for drastic change amongst the comic book industry. So what happened was a Comic Code Authority was established. Comic Code Authority was a self-governing body of different professionals within the comic book industry who wanted to censor comics themselves. Now, some of the representatives who joined in the beginning days of this was DC Comics and Marvel Comics. Comic books would not be able to be sold directly to the market base at the time of comic book stores and also newsstands, if it did not have the Comic Code Authority approval. So there were 7 rules, 3 of which focused on sexual relations amongst the characters who were found in comics. I know, they're comics characters. How can they have sexual anyway? But that was the focus on this in 1950s uptight America. The 3 points were illicit sex relations are neither to be hindered or portrayed. The treatment of love, romance stories, self-emphasize the value of home and sanctity of marriage, which means everyone had to get married, everyone had to talk about marriage. If you're dating, you're leading to marriage, and so on and so forth. You know, better not get your girl pregnant, blah, 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 blah. Sexual perversion of any type was strictly forbidden. Like any type of sexual perversion. So you couldn't even be a tubby. Now, this wasn't a significant change to many LGBTQ plus characters because at the time, they haven't yet really appeared directly out in American comics. But what was happening during this entire time period, the 1950s and 1960s, was it was more queerbaiting. So you were led to believe that characters would be queer because they would hint at it constantly throughout the comics themselves. But it did make it possible for the appearance of these characters to begin to be talked about for future issues. Characters who even had the potential to be sexual had to find appropriate love interests. So for instance, Batman and Robin all of a sudden now had girlfriends. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but they had to find girlfriends. As visibility of queer people became more mainstream, the representation was found much more in American comics. Now in 1963, there became a hero by the name of elementlab, and he was a part of the DC Legions of Heroes from the future. And elementlab had, let's say, some difficulties when it came to finding women who he had an interest in. So he would always go on these superhero adventures and he would never be able to take them out on dates because he was so busy. And then when there was opportunities for them to go on a date, he'd be like, oh no, I had this superhero thing I had to do, and I can't just find the right girl for me. And then they'd be like, wait, I can work around your schedule. But he's like, no, it can't happen. And this went on for the entire 1960s. And everyone, the readers start to write in and they start to say, hey, he's probably gay. And they'd be like, no, he just can't find the right girlfriend. Or did he have any interest in girls, really? That was continuous. So it was like this kind of thing that the readers would kind of catch on, and they kind of would see, you know, the queerdom within it, kind of like the Disney movie Luca, which is also not supposed to be gay or queer. But we all saw it during Pride. We know what happened in that movie. That was a queer-ass movie. You know it. So in the 1970s and 1980s, things were definitely changing for queer people as our representation was much more visible in media than it was before. This is a continuation of a story, right? And what happens is that you start to see that representation in comics once again, but they're doing it now much more direct. So it's not really the same thing that you saw with elementlab when it was like, we don't know, but we know. It was much more direct representation. And one of the first direct forms of representation was found in this issue of the Incredible Hulk, where Bruce Banner is nearly raped in the YMCA. You heard that right, YMCA, you know. He's nearly raped in the YMCA by two men, and they're both homosexual men. And Bruce Banner, who is this super heterosexual man, then hulks out into, you know, like the Hulk. And then they're like, oh no. And then that's supposed to be the whole end of the story. So one of the first outright representation that, hey, these characters are queer is pretty much, you know, the Hulk, you know, running into the YMCA, which is, you know, hate to break it to you, is a pretty gay spot. Him running into them and them trying to sexually assault him, but he hulks out. And that's the end of that story for these homos. A better representation came in 1980s when DC Comics produced a maximum series called Camelot 3000. Now, Camelot 3000 was not approved by the Comic Code Authority. DC never submitted it. Instead, it was marketed as a mature reader's book. What happens in it is that King Arthur and Merlin are reincarnated in the modern day era. I mean, modern day 1980s, right? So they're reincarnated into the modern day 1980s, and they need to find the other knights of the round table itself. What happens is that one of the main characters, Tristan, is born into a body of a woman. And this leads him to have a massive identity crisis as it relates to masculinity, who he is in the world. I mean, before he's this medieval times knight, and now he's in the body of this weak, supposedly weak woman. What doesn't also help his journey is that his lover is reincarnated as well, but she's in the body of a woman, and he doesn't want to be intimate from having a female body to another female body as well. So it causes this huge conflict between himself and between them as it relates to intimacy. Also, there's another additional American comic that comes out around the same time that focuses on gender swapping, and this will be Alpha Flight. Alpha Flight is this Marvel Comics that's the premier Canadian superhero team. You know, because you know, it's Canada, so they need a superhero team, right? And what happens in this story is that two of the main characters, they also swap bodies as well, and they play around with gender norms, and it's not really written about afterwards or do the characters talk about it, but it really sticks with the queer readers themselves who is trying to find their representation as they're reading American comics in the 1980s. Now, storylines were still vetoed by editors because of the fear of the Comic Code Authority. One of the most infamous incidents of this happening in the 1980s was the appearance of Nightcrawler. So Nightcrawler is a very popular X-Men. He could teleport around, so on and so forth. His mom in the comics is Mystique. So Mystique couldn't shapeshift, right? And also his dad in the comic is it's written as unmarked for a bit. I think in the cartoon series is Sabretooth, but and then it turns out to be this whole other mess that happens in the comic book series. But anyway, his original parent, his original mom was going to be Destiny. And Mystique would have shape-shifted into the body of a man, and she would have impregnated Destiny. But the comic book editors really thought that this was too much to handle in the 1980s, and they really didn't want that to be the case, that Nightcrawler Parents would have been, you know, gender fluid, but also appeared as two women. In 1989, the Comic Code Authority allowed Marvel Comics to have one of their superheroes come out as gay. They chose the superhero Nuh Undastnd, who was part of the team Alpha Flight. You remember the Canadians, woohoo, right? And he was, you know, it was a popular moment for queer comic book readers because they were able to identify with Nuh Undastnd. Nuh Undastnd also becomes the first comic book character in comic book history to have a same-sex marriage as well in 2012. The Comic Code Authority lost its influence throughout the 1990s and the early 2000s. And it officially folded in 2011. After a certain point, there was no way to argue about the existence of queer life and queer characters existing in comic books. So editors and curators behind the scenes start to begin to embrace queer characters, and there's not the same amount of queerbaiting that was popular in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. Now today, there are numerous openly queer characters in American comics. And you see the ranges of that in all different types of ways of forms and different ethnicities and races. There's a lot more diversity as it relates to queer characters and not all white in American comics. And that's really exciting because that really speaks to the demographic movements that we see across the country. So that's big because for me personally, like, I didn't really see that. You know, when I was a kid going through, you know, reading my comic books in the comic book store, if I saw queer comic representation, the ones that were there was usually white, very white. And, you know, I can't identify with it. But now you can see different ranges of different experiences. So that's quite exciting. Like, queerdom and geekdom are one and the same because our influence has always been felt in American comics. Like, one of the things that we see, you know, that I wish I knew about when I was trying to find my own representation as I was reading the comic books as a 12-year-old kid and just feeling really weirded out and not like I had a community, but I attached myself to these fictional characters who were in essence queer, you know? Their storylines were queer, their drama was queer, the things that would happen to them were queer themselves. And because of that, I saw a similar influence. I saw something beyond myself as a representative within these characters. They didn't necessarily have to come out as gay or bi or whatever the case were. They were queer to me. And that's the whole thing. Queerdom is American comics. You can't take it out. It's not a separate element from one another. Like, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock simply landed on us. And I think that that's the most important thing to remember as a takeaway for this episode. Well, that's all I have for now. Shady out.